From New Jersey, this is Low Fidelity. I'm Jeff Heller.
And I'm Mike Labrie. On this episode, we will be discussing the early works of composer Steve Reich.
You can support Low Fidelity by reviewing us on iTunes, subscribing to us on our Reddit and YouTube channels, and by following Lo-Fi Podcast on Twitter.
All the links you need are in the description of this here episode. You're always welcome to share any feedback in the comments, though, or send an email to feedback@lowfidelity.info.
Welcome to Low Fidelity, everybody. It has been a while. I think some apologies are in order first.
It's all my fault.
Nope, it's my fault. No, we're not going to do this. We're going to share the blame, Mike.
All right.
It's been a number of different things happening personally and professionally, and couldn't get schedules worked out, and it's just been kind of a mess. I've got a little bit of something to make up for it that I'm not going to share this episode, but next episode.
Oh, yes.
You'll see what that entails. But for the time being, we have some stuff to get through. We have this really interesting topic that I am really looking forward to sharing with everybody. But before we get to that, I actually have some feedback from the Sung Tongs review on our last episode from a couple months ago. And we got a comment from someone named AxeWorld on our YouTube channel. They said on our review that even though they may not have agreed with our opinions, they still appreciated the dissections of the tracks and the things we had to say about them, which I think is wonderful. And really, that's kind of what I want to see, what our podcast does for people.
I know a lot of people, when you're coming into critical review and analysis, whether you know it or not, you might go into something just hoping you're going to hear your own opinions parroted back at you. And if you do, maybe sometimes that's great. And if you don't, well, hopefully that's a challenging conversation and a challenging thought, and doesn't mean anyone's right or wrong on it. It's just, it sets up a better conversation. That's what we're looking for.
I agree. And really, if you have a difference of opinion, you should feel welcome to share it on Reddit, YouTube, send us an email.
Of all the people, we are willing to listen to it and hear you out for sure.
Absolutely. But at least, if anything, that appreciation for craftsmanship is really important to me. So I was very happy by that comment, but that's not why I'm mentioning him. For some reason, his avatar on YouTube seemed awfully familiar. And it turns out that months earlier, I had actually stumbled upon his work on SoundCloud and YouTube, and he actually did some really interesting things with Animal Collective. He would combine the live performances of the band and remix in elements from the commercially released albums. In that vein, he has two remix projects that he's put out. The first one's called This Is the New Centipede. This came out in early 2017, and it takes the album Centipede Hurts from 2012 and mixes it in with their live performances from that tour. The other one is called Repainting Along. This was released in early 2018, and it combines the Animal Collective album Painting With from 2016 with that tour. Mike, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Tell me about a time where you heard a band live and you wished that they had captured the energy on their studio album or vice versa.
Yeah, there's a couple that come to mind, and knowing who I am, I'm jumping immediately to the drive-through days. I think of two bands in particular. One is The Starting Line, and one is Early November. Early November, you and I touched upon in previous incarnations of the podcast here. Starting Line was always very well known as just a great live, in-person, great energy kind of band. And I think a lot of that was reflected in some of the early stuff, early demos. And then when we got the first full length, which was produced by Mark Trombino, like it was there, but the production kind of took over a little bit in many ways, and you lost some of that live energy.
From my world of things, I'm sure for people who know me, this is an obvious example, but Fish.
Yeah.
Easily. Because apart from certain albums that I feel do really well with their album treatment, nothing compares to seeing them live.
Yeah.
And just the energy they have. So I like the idea of what AxeWorld does in his projects, of combining these two things.
Yeah.
Because, what you're seeing is identifying that there's something missing and filling it. It's as easy as that. And especially when the technology is that easy to acquire, then what's stopping you, right? Now, what I did with this information was go and reach out to him on Twitter because I really enjoyed his work. And so I just wanted to ask him a little bit about it. But in regards to the question of why did you do it, he had this to say. I just really liked how different the live versions of some of the Centipede songs sounded. And I thought, hey, why not throw the album version in and see if it works? That's all it takes, right?
Yeah.
Now, granted, he did also share another YouTuber named Patrick Cederberg who happened to do something of the same vein before him, and that also could have provided some inspiration. And it was with a project called Tomboiled. Now, this project mixes Panda Bear's solo album Tomboy from 2011 with live performances from that tour. It's the same idea, just different album, but coincidentally Animal Collective member in this case. But still, really interesting results out of that. Again, I want to thank AxeWorld for leaving us the comment on our YouTube page. I, of course, am going to link to his project so you can check it out. Both of his projects can be found on YouTube, but only New Centipede is on SoundCloud. It just turned out to be some, unexpectedly, some copyright issues there. Definitely worth checking checking out. And if you happen to have any feedback for us, please, by all means, feel free to leave a comment in our YouTube or Reddit channels, feedback@lofidelity.info. But with that, I think we're ready to go into our main topic. What we're going to talk about today is the early works of composer Steve Reich, and these are pieces that were composed in the late 60s, early 70s. The way this is going to work is somewhat similar to how we did our Ambitious Projects episode, where we break things into segments and we just cover each one. And we're going to start with who Steve Reich is and why we're covering him. We're then going to move on to the environment. In this case, an extremely brief history of 20th century classical, like super brief. We'll then review a selection of his earliest works that all have to do with a technique known as phasing, and we'll define what that means. And these works include It's Gonna Rain from 1965, Come Out from 1966, Piano Phase from 1967, and Clapping Music from 1972. And then we'll finish up with some further listening.
So Jeff, who is Steve Reich?
Steve Reich is an American composer, most commonly attributed to the minimalism movement of the late 1960s, but has been consistently composing, performing, and releasing music for over 50 years. His most recent work as of this recording, Pulse Quartet, was released in 2017, 81 years old at the time of this release. Now, I have a hypothesis that a large swath of the music that we hear today has some remnant of his work in it. So as we talk about the work going forward, I want our listeners to consider the following 3 points. Number one, as one of the early practitioners of sampling, his application of rhythm to the samples provided a pivotal evolutionary step in turning the avant-garde practice of referencing existing sounds and voices to them being used as core elements of song structure.
Sorry, I'm going to jump ahead to even things like Girl Talk most recently, where you take a sample here and the sample is intrinsically music in and of itself, but then it's used to set up like a completely separate beat, and that's being repeated over and over to set up a new rhythm to start something else. You hear the origin here for sure.
Number two, his background in percussion and rhythm is fully infused in his music, which in conjunction with other minimalist composers would precede the practice of using sequencers, especially in electronic dance music. Lastly, number three, I think he has a unique practicality about him, which is usually buried in his quintessential New York sardonic wit, which we're going to hear in his interviews for sure. And this makes the simplest of his compositions easy to reproduce and experiment with, especially with today's technology. I hate to phrase it this way, but it's stuff that's ripe for memes.
The way he describes things, it's so approachable, but it's got this... we'll get to it because you'll hear him and I think it'll come to light.
Yeah, it's not what I think about when I picture a composer talking about music. It's a lot funnier than that.
It's great. It's great.
We'll get to it, yeah. Before we move any further, I just want to ask you, Mike.
Yeah.
How often do you research bands that you like to see what their influences are?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to one of the earliest discussions in the latest incarnation of Low Fidelity. What kind of music appreciation snob are you? And how much research do you do for what reasons? Not a lot. Usually I find it comes out naturally, whether that be through later collaborations or covers or something like that. If I'm getting really into a band, maybe. But like I said, I think it just naturally comes out in the open. Get Up Kids is my favorite band of all time. I think the influence is there. You've seen them in covers and some of the other bands they've joined and worked with over the years. It's kind of open. I listen to some other podcasts here and there as well, and I don't go out of my way to find things, but when I do enjoy listening to it. And I hear a lot of the same names come up over and over again. So, I'll do it. I'm open to listening to it, but I'm not sitting there going down a Wikipedia hole every other day or anything.
See, that's funny because as you referenced, I think it was episode 9, our music discovery episode, where we broke this down, and you're a backstorian and I'm a songsmith, I think is what our designations were. Right. I'm the one that goes down the internet-sized rabbit hole every time I hear something I like.
I'll do it, but I'm not throwing myself into these kinds of research projects all the time.
Yeah, right. Understandable. Well, can you believe that most of the time, not most of the time, but a lot of the time, when I go to do this research on my own, I tend to find Steve Reich's name.
I'm not surprised.
Somewhere in there. It's to the point where I don't even look for his name in particular. It just is there. Like, I'll listen to an interview, and then all of a sudden his name is thrown out there, and I'm like, once again, here he is.
Taking it back to a previous episode, I mean, my appreciation for video game music in particular, I don't have to take 2 steps before I fall into a YMO reference. I mean, it's just constantly there.
So really, that is why we're going to be covering him on the show at this point. Especially going forward when we cover more albums, we're going to find a running thread where his name is probably going to appear in a lot of the stuff that we listen to. That out of the way, we're going to do a quick bio for him later. But for now, we're going to talk about the environment, because I have a hunch, and follow me with this, if you will, Mike. I have a hunch that most of our audience is unfamiliar with 20th century classical. Probably.
It might be one piece that you think of, and I'm about to name some things, and I think I'm going to be the quintessential 21st century classical music knowledge kind of person here.
Yeah, and of course this includes myself too, but Even Reich himself has said in interviews that he was brought up with quote-unquote middle-class favorites, basically music written within 1750 and 1900. In fact, to kind of prove the point, Mike, name me some classical composers.
Right. Well, the seminal composer of our day, Sir Mix-a-Lot, Baby Got Back. You think Beethoven Fifth Symphony is, I'm sure, one of the first things that comes to mind for most people. You want to get a little Mozart in there. Maybe something a little more recent, maybe a one-hit wonder, Karl Orff, and maybe some Strauss in there as well.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And I think also, if we include the pieces that we know from other forms of media, something like the 2001 Space Odyssey theme, great. That exactly proves my point. Let's add to that vocabulary a little bit. To be fair, it would be literally impossible to cover the whole of 20th century classical right now. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to look at 3 seminal works from the early half of the 20th century. And this is going to help paint a picture of the direction classical music was heading to, the same vein Reich himself ends up following when he reaches his formal music education. We'll be playing excerpts here, but I definitely recommend our listeners go and listen to each of these pieces in full because they are phenomenal in their own right. We're going to start with Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. The Rite of Spring is a Russian ballet and orchestral work first premiered in Paris, France in 1913. It is still considered by contemporary critics to be the greatest piece of music of the 20th century. That is a hefty label.
Yep.
Mike, you and I actually watched some of this.
Yeah, I kind of didn't want to stop. I wanted to keep watching. I'm not the kind of person that would normally sit and watch a ballet. From the moment this started, I was entranced by it.
It's funny you say that because the reception that this piece got in Paris is maybe the complete opposite.
You know, we don't always appreciate things at the time that they're made and that we have them.
That's very true. But on further reading of the story behind the premiere in Paris, there's a conspiracy attached to this a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Where the person who was in charge of the choreography, I believe, of the piece, specifically set up seating arrangements where the students, the younger people who could get attached to modern music a bit easier, would be sitting next to the old guard that didn't want to hear anything new. And so when the piece starts and immediately people are freaking out from the old guard, the new students are saying, no, this is fine, everything's okay. And it just gets into chaos because there's that controversy going on.
Manufactured controversy, all right.
Right, it could be, exactly. But still, what is it about the piece that led to this reaction? And I think it has to do with some of the innovations behind it. First of all, the Rite of Spring pushes players to perform notes or tones that exist outside of the instrument's comfortable range. The opening bassoon melody, for example, that is way up there in the high notes of that bassoon. It is extremely risky to play that high. In fact, here's an example of what it sounds like when you don't hit those notes correctly. In addition to that, the music itself is loud, with shrieks from the brass instruments and stark oral assaults that strike the ear. I think that's absolutely true. You can hear it in some of the most dissonant moments as they strike all of a sudden. Also in the Rite of Spring, there are moments of polyrhythm, and this is where 2 rhythmic timings happen at the same time.
Yeah.
Lastly, it is heavily, heavily dissonant. Supposedly after it premiered in Paris, where it caused the near riot, one critic noted, quote, "The music always goes to the note next to the one you expect," end quote.
And that just keeps you on edge and wanting more.
I agree with that. I mean, there's a limit to where you can go and lose me. You know? Like,
you need that relief somewhere. You got to give me that note at some point, and then we can start over again.
That whole idea of going back to that note, we're going to talk about later when we talk about tonal music. That's actually going to be really important. The Rite of Spring is a brilliant piece of work. I absolutely recommend people check it out. We will certainly have links to this and other pieces in the show notes.
Yeah, I think more than anything else, if you can take my advice, set aside some time to sit and watch something you would never think to watch, this is the thing you got to do it with.
Next, let's talk about composer Arnold Schoenberg. Schoenberg was an Austrian composer of the earliest 20th century who invented, or arguably discovered, the 12-tone system. In order to explain what that is, you have to understand what tonal music is first. Tonal music is the majority of what we listen to in Western musical culture. It's based on there being a tonic or a home tone. I've mentioned the tonic a couple of times when I've done my breakdowns in previous episodes, and a good example of this sort of thing is Happy Birthday. And how appropriate, because I believe you just had a birthday recently, didn't you, Mike?
Yeah, I suppose so.
I have to do something for you since it was your birthday.
All right.
Check this out. I'm going to sing Happy Birthday to you. I think it's appropriate. And I'm going to start by just doing the first measure here. Happy birthday. That tone that you hear in the background, that is the key of C. So that's our home tone, or the tonic as they call it. What's going to happen next is I'm going to move to G and then go back home. To you. Happy birthday to you. There we go, back to C. We're then going to leave home again, this time to F and then G, but we're still going to come back home. Happy birthday, dear Michael. I hope you don't mind me calling you Michael and this is belated.
We can do it.
Happy birthday to you. You can jump across tones in different directions, and you might even not play the home tone at all, but everything you play relates back to that home tone in some harmonic way.
Yeah, for sure.
That is tonal music. Atonal music.
Well, by definition, doesn't, right?
Right, exactly. Antitonal, right? Atonal music does not do that. And it's a bit unfair to label it that way because any gibberish you play sounds atonal. Like just any mess of keys that you hit is atonal, sure. But in the case of Schoenberg, there could be systems behind it.
Okay.
Even though it doesn't reach the same harmonic heights that we're used to, it could still have some dramatic pull. Now, the 12-tone system that he discovered or invented, however you want to view it, as an example, sounds to the untrained ear like chaos. And I didn't want to bring in Steve Reich just yet, but I really like how he describes the 12-tone system. Here's how he puts it.
There are basic ways of writing 12-tone music. One way is you have a 12-tone row, the 12 notes arranged in some order, and you play them, and then you write them out in some order, and then you, what they call retrograde, you play them backwards, and then you take that and you invert it, and so on and so forth.
The example we're going to listen to of one of Schoenberg's pieces is String Quartet No. 4. This is from 1936. What you're hearing here is a series of 12 notes played in sequence with musical movements built around them. It's as simple as that. And he's really taking a traditional form of classical music that's popular at the time, in this case a waltz, and he's just doing something really different with it. Even though we don't get that tonal center, it still has something of a structure to it, and we can kind of get it. It's just that we're not getting any sort of harmonic emotion that we normally would with tonal music.
Yeah.
Let's compare this to the Rite of Spring. In this case, the whole composition is dissonant yet systematic, and in the case of the Rite of Spring, what Stravinsky's doing there is he's composing for the moment because he has a ballet to score, essentially. I mean, the same way that we have classical music and we have soundtracks or scores.
I was going to say, so you're scoring to a film, something like that. You know, they may have edited the video already or not yet, but you know, at some point, if there's going to be a gunshot or a foot stomp or something, you have to time a musical beat to that.
Exactly. So it's different in this way because he's doing it for the purpose of the score. And here it's just its own piece. Schoenberg would become more of an educator and evangelist than composer with his 12-tone system and would prove to be very influential. He would also become part of a greater serialism movement that, with passionate followers, would push through the 20th century with a quote-unquote post-tonal mentality, music that no longer had to follow the constrained rules of the harmonic series. It could be more complex than that and still have emotional relevance. All right, our last piece that we're going to talk about is by composer Karlheinz Stockhausen. Stockhausen was a German composer considered an early pioneer of electronic music in the mid-20th century. Mike, do me a favor, read me a quick bio of Mr. Stockhausen.
Yes, so it was born in Germany in 1928. Had a little sister and brother would follow in 1932, but shortly after his brother's birth, his mother experienced a mental breakdown and was institutionalized. 9 years later, his family was informed that she died of leukemia. It was quickly understood, however, that she had been gassed by the Nazis, as was part of their genocidal initiative to murder those who were, quote-unquote, useless eaters, referring to those in mental institutions. Only 4 years after her death, he would meet his father, a soldier in the German army, for the last time during a leave from the war where he would be told, "I'm not coming back, look after things." Now, a 2008 piece for The Guardian said this about his musical approach. He could not tolerate regular rhythm because it made him think of the Nazi marching songs played endlessly on the radio during his childhood. Schoenberg's serial methods provided the inspiration to explode the old order in pitch and rhythm, and the next logical step was to drill down into the nature of sound itself and construct new ones.
Imagine with me, if you will, being a child, growing up in a country where you are negatively affected by a political agenda, and having to endure that agenda's propaganda constantly throughout your developing years. When that propaganda is filled with melodic, rhythmic, and grand harmonious statements, of course you rebel, and the nebulous realm of serialism would provide the comfort one might need when the norms of your environment constrain you. So talking about the real innovation behind Stockhausen, what he did that would trailblaze new paths in classical music, at the time of what we would consider his college years, there was a movement in France known as musique concrète, where recorded sounds of voices, instruments, noises from planes, trains, and other ambient elements would be manipulated in a studio to produce organized sound. Meanwhile, in Germany, the school of thought behind electronic music was that it had to be produced in the studio environment with pure electronic sound produced by oscillators, sine waves, white noise generators, all the stuff we would normally disregard as emergency tones or static noise. Stockhausen broke barriers by combining these two different themes of electronic music and employed various procedures of analog tape manipulation with generated electronic sounds. An example of this, we're going to take a listen to Gesang der Jünglinge from 1955. To give you an idea of what you just heard, here's an excerpt from the Wikipedia page for the Studio for Electronic Musicians of the West German Radio, or WDR, the studio in which the piece was composed.
Stockhausen established connections between the different categories of human speech sounds on the one hand, and those of the three main types of sound production in the studio on the other. Vowels correspond to sine tones and their combinations, plosive consonants, so P, K, T, to pulses, and fricative consonants, such as F, S, and then the SH and CH syllables, to rushing noises. Stockhausen, on the one hand, subjected the recording of a child's voice to the same manipulations as the sounds and noises produced in the studio, and on the other hand, tried to approximate the latter in various degrees to vocal sounds. He wanted to achieve a continuum between electronic and human sound.
There's method to the madness, basically.
Yeah.
The same way that Schoenberg had some method to the madness with the 12-tone system that to us sounds crazy, but to the trained ear has a system to it and makes sense. Going back to Stockhausen, what he does here is really interesting, where he did originally experiment with Schoenberg's 12-tone series during his formal music education, but he would evolve that by converting tone frequencies to values that affected metrics such as duration of sounds, dynamics, and even the timbre of instruments. In fact, timbre is one of the bigger difficulties in producing electronic noise, because how do you change the shape of a sound when you're working with direct samples?
Yeah.
Stockhausen quickly became widely popularized by Cologne radio broadcasts and would go on to compose 376 individually performed works. He would teach as a visiting professor at various universities in the United States and Europe, and would even end up on the cover of the Beatles' legendary album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, much to his chagrin. He passed away at the age of 79 in 2007. Stockhausen to this day has proven incredibly influential, along with the Rite of Spring and Schoenberg's 12-tone series, and serialism as a whole. Besides the Sgt. Pepper cover, the Beatles tried their hand at this technique with their own studio technology with the hidden track that's at the end of Sgt. Pepper. But also with the composition Revolution 9 from the White Album.
For sure, yeah.
Everyone in the music as time went by, they'd get a little bit older and a little bit slower.
And some names you may have heard of, Frank Zappa, David Bowie, Miles Davis, even Bjork have openly named these works as influences.
You just think about that and, oh, all right, I draw the connection immediately.
There you have it, a brief 3-part summary of the history of 20th century classical music, the early half anyway. And this is the environment in which Steve Reich would find himself in his own formal musical education. We'll get more into his experience there in a little bit. But first, a quick biography. Steve Reich was born in 1936 in New York City to Broadway lyricist June Silman and lawyer Leonard Reich. And in case you're wondering, he hasn't, to my knowledge, ever stated a preference for how to pronounce it. He has mentioned that his German grandfather pronounced it Reich, but Ellis Island Americanization turns it into Reich. His original aspirations were to be a jazz drummer and would go see Miles Davis perform in the jazz clubs of New York City, since he had access to them as a teen. And along with bebop jazz and the drumming of Buddy Rich, he also took great inspiration from Johann Sebastian Bach and Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring.
Yeah, fancy that.
He graduated from Cornell with a BA in philosophy, studied music composition at Juilliard, and got his master's degree at Mills College in Oakland, California. And it is there, around 1962, where he studied under acclaimed composer Luciano Berio. Berio, an Italian composer, was a well-regarded experimentalist who took an invitation to teach at Mills. Considering all that we have mentioned about surrealism, atonality, music void of rhythm, can you imagine a jazz-bopping Bach head jumping headfirst into 12-tone music? It seems silly to me, at least. But here's what Reich had to say about composing with the 12-tone row and Berio's response.
Since everybody had to write 12-tone music, I did as well. I just repeated it over and over again. And Berio saw this, and he said, if you want to write tonal music, why don't you write tonal music? And I said, that's what I'm trying to do.
Here's another quote I love from him. This is from a Guardian interview in 2013.
As they say in The Godfather, you've got to stay close to your friends, you've got to stay closer to your enemies.
Turns out Reich was in good company on the West Coast. He would collaborate and perform with composers that were seeking to create simpler tonal works. In fact, one of the most notable in this period was Terry Riley's In C from 1964, in which he played the Wurlitzer organ in a key rhythmic role that kept everyone on beat. He and his contemporaries flat out rejected 12-tone music as a whole, and according to Reich, that was for a good reason.
This is not Europe. This is America. This is, John Coltrane's playing at the Jazz Workshop. There are, hamburgers being sold. There's this Motown on the radio. How can you pretend in a world like that you're living in the dark brown angst of Vienna at the turn of the century? Or even that you're living in a bombed out Cologne at the Westdeutsche Rundfunk in 1945? It's just not true.
Reich's experimentation would lead him to manipulating tape, and with a portable recorder, he one day headed to Union Square in San Francisco, where he stumbled upon a Pentecostal preacher describing a devastating flood. And that brings us to the first of our 4 Reich pieces we will discuss on this episode. Before we get into that discussion, though, we are going to briefly break down each piece first and describe what it is that you're going to hear. We begin with It's Gonna Rain from 1965. We start with an elongated sample of the Pentecostal preacher.
He began to warn the people. He said, after a while, it's going to rain after a while, for 40 days and for 40 nights. And the people didn't believe him. And they began to laugh at him. And they began to mock him. And they began to say, it ain't going to rain.
An excerpt of that sample then plays repeatedly.
It's going to rain, 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 it's going to rain.
A tiny snippet of that excerpt then plays, but instead of it repeating on the same part, it slowly moves along the excerpt to the end, then back to the beginning, then forward and back again. The excerpt is then played repeatedly with the left ear slowly proceeding ahead of the right, creating a cacophony of competing voices and bird flapping rhythm. Now on the second sample, a full line of the preacher is played.
They didn't believe that it was going to rain, but glory to God, hallelujah. Bless God's wonderful name this evening. I said this evening, after a while, they didn't believe that it was going to rain, but sure enough, it began to rain, hallelujah. They began to knock upon the door, but it was too late. Whew. The Bible tell me they knocked upon the door until the skin came off their hand. Whew. My Lord, my Lord. I said until the skin came off their hand, they cried. I could just hear they cry now. I could hear them say, oh, Noah, would you just open the door? But Noah couldn't open the door. It had been sealed by the hand of God.
Small pieces of the second sample are arranged out of order, but in a melodic sequence.
Glory to God, God had been sealed. Couldn't open the door. Oh, Noah, they cried. You just opened the door. Couldn't open the door. But sure enough, hallelujah. Glory to God, God had been sealed. Couldn't open the door. Oh, Noah, they cried. You just opened the door. Couldn't open the door. But sure enough, hallelujah. Glory to God, God.
The sequence then plays in each ear with the left ear slowly proceeding ahead. The sequence is then interrupted with more instances of the sequence playing alongside it, duplicating samples that are playing concurrently. This whole cacophony is then combined into the center channel before it is then played quicker in the left ear, effectively creating an even bigger noise before finally fading out. Welcome to the practice of phasing, a process in which a sample of sound repeats continuously with a slight delay in one channel, causing the samples to gradually play out of sync, forcing us to place rhythm and sometimes harmony where it wouldn't normally appear. Steve Reich effectively pioneered this technique by stumbling upon it by mistake, and instead of throwing it away as a mistake, made it an intentional exercise for us to look for music within the noise. Mike, what I want you to do now is just tell me the story about your first listen.
Right.
Because this is the first time you've heard of this composer. It's the first time you've ever heard these pieces of music. I'm going to spoil a little bit of the story by saying I warned you ahead of time to not play this around your wife because she'd kill you. But that's all I'm going to spoil. Tell me the rest.
So what I did is the two of us were going for a long drive. I forget where we're going. We had someplace to go. It's going to be like an hour or so. All right, I got to listen to this thing for Jeff. Let's put it on in the car. And you know where I live, we made it approximately to Target before we decided, nope, off. The two of us together at the same time. Like, this is not the right environment for something like this. I'm clearly going to get into an accident or someone's going to hit me and then cause us to get
So the first thing you do, and I tell you not to play it next to Mary.
Of course. Whatever you tell me not to do, Jeff, you know me by now. I'm going to do that exact thing. I like to listen to things in different environments. I do it in the car. I do it at work. I do it at home, at the gym. You know, I need the different types of speakers, different types of environments to pull out different things in the music. And that is not the right way to listen to Steve Reich.
Gotcha. So how many times in total would you say you listened to it?
1.2.
Right.
No, I definitely listened to it in full at least twice. And then, you know, multiple more times, just kind of skipping ahead, listen, all right, this is where it does this. All right, this is where it does this. For most of these, going into it as a review, it's not the kind of thing that you need to listen to more than, I'd say, twice.
I would really agree with that because I feel as though the first time you hear it, you have to get used to the concept.
Yeah, what is it that I'm doing here? This is not, I'm sitting down to listen to an XTC album. This is a very different type of approach.
Right. You have to normalize what it is that you're hearing. And then once you've gotten over that, the second time you can then pull out other things. Would you say that it was like something of a relief when samples that were opposing each other finally sort of met a rhythm of some kind?
Is that kind of what we're talking about earlier with like the home row, if you will, like the tonic? You're coming back to what is that relief in the sound when things meet together again?
Sort of, right? Because it's heading out in a direction and then it is coming back to something that we can recognize. And when you listen to the musicianship behind the voice that's going on and the bird flapping rhythm, and really it's more than a melodic thing. It's really a rhythmic thing.
I think that's why a preacher is a great first step for something like this, because there is a rhythm to it in the delivery that you are hearing from the person delivering the sermon. Like, of course, that's wonderful.
This experimentation, what he does, rather than immediately make it rhythmic and out of sync, but make the syllables match up in a rhythmic sense, he doesn't do that. He actually splits it up and lets it naturally happen that way.
Right.
So technically it's a mistake, but he lets it play out regardless. I want to bring in a quote from Brian Eno about this piece in particular, because he gets into some of the science a little bit about why we're able to pick out these rhythms in this music.
I mean, the Steve Reich tape pieces really are oral moire patterns. A moire pattern is the superimposition of two very, very simple patterns. They might just be parallel lines. When you superimpose them and you move them in relation to each other, you get very complex and unexpected movements. And I think the Reich piece, the tape pieces, work in the same way. They take advantage of the fact that your brain is very creative. It was sort of transferring the job of being the composer into the brain of the listener. So it's saying to the listener, your brain is actually making this piece of music, because you knew what the ingredients were. There's nothing mysterious about how the piece works.
It's gonna rain after a while.
So that takes us to Come Out in 1966. I think, whereas the previous work was a mistake turned into a work, I like where this is a very deliberate construction. Let's start with the structure of Come Out. The piece begins with a sample of a man describing a bruise on his leg.
I had to open the bruise up and let some of the bruise blood come out to show them.
An excerpt of that sample then plays repeatedly.
Come out to show them, 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 come out to show them.
The excerpt is then phased, the right ear playing faster.
Come out to show them, come out to show them, come out.
At the first rhythmic match, the competing excerpts are then combined and played in both ears before that is then phased. Now with 4 competing samples, 2 in each ear, the 4 repeating samples are then combined in each ear and phased before very slowly fading out.
Now, Mike, do you find this particular piece to be more or less rhythmic than It's Gonna Rain?
I feel like more, but I don't know how or why.
Well, this is what I find fascinating. We originally were talking about how with Pentecostal preachers or just in religion, music is a big part of it. Sermons are very musical in general. Here we have a sample that's very different. It's not religion-based at all. This is a person describing a bruise on their leg. Sounds fairly normal. And yet, the way that they were saying the words and the way that it's being repeated here, the tempos tend to match more often, I feel like, or at least the way that he's speaking is more conductive to finding rhythm than with It's Gonna Rain, where I think it was more about the competition of the samples. And here it's a little bit more harmonious. So going back to what we were talking about with finding rhythm or finding melody, you know, you doing the work essentially, or you being the composer.
Yeah, your brain there.
In this case, I actually feel as though more listens lets you find more things in the piece. And I actually listen to Come Out more often than It's Gonna Rain.
Yeah, I think I gave it more listens as well myself.
It was a lot more pleasant of an experience too.
Well, yeah, and we'll get to the story about it, whether that's pleasant or not. Maybe it's because, but they're all very short samples here. It's gonna rain, come out to show them, come out to show them. But there's something, maybe it's just the structure of those words. I feel like there's a sermon sound to it as well.
And especially when you're forced to have to listen to it in this vein where it's phasing, where it's literally going out of sync and then not really back in sync, but rather rhythmically finding a pattern. There were certain patterns that I would hear at the later half, the second time or the third time that I didn't hear the first time, or like something in the 7th time that I didn't hear in the 10th time.
Definitely.
And so it's a new experience every time I listen to it. Another piece about this in particular that I find different with It's Gonna Rain is the sh percussion, you know, because he's talking about come out to show them. And the sh is such a hard sound, kind of like what Stockhausen was doing. He noticed those. This fricative consonant actually creates rhythm because of just how pronounced it is, especially in the sample. So I'm listening to Come Out and I'm hearing sh, 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 sh. And so I'm getting a rhythm out of that.
I'm thinking something like a maraca or even a cymbal or a tambourine or something. You get that sh, sh sound in there.
Like the kind of thing we would see in like an a cappella performance, basically. A little bit about the backstory to this. Like I said, Mike, not really the best of situations. This piece was originally composed for a benefit event that spread awareness of the Harlem Six, which were a group of 6 black teenagers that were imprisoned in the 1960s without due process and regularly beaten to the point of needing hospitalization. Whether this piece actually did anything for the cause is debatable, but in fact, some articles I've read on the piece nowadays compare the way our brains deal with the assault of noise with the repetition of news stories in the media, and that it's actually a very dangerous thing because it threatens to dehumanize the subject and instead turn them into a musical phrase.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. Amadou Diallo. He was an immigrant from Guinea who was shot and killed in 1999 by 4 plainclothes New York City police officers. I had to look him up first in order to write that description of what happened to him because all I remember was the musicality of his name and that he got killed by cops. And I certainly remember how often I heard his name in the media at the time.
Another name that comes to mind for me that we kind of lost the story, Elian Gonzalez.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, he was the
Cuban boy
that showed up in the U.S. and did we ship him out? What did we do with him?
Exactly.
Right.
And I don't know, it was, I think, a little bit of the name, but then just the repeated news cycle of it.
I do think that it puts an interesting spin on the piece nowadays.
Yeah.
Because we're faced with this whether we want to be or not.
Yeah. You think of, God, I think of Jeremy by Pearl Jam and the focus on violence in the classroom, something like that. Does it becoming a song like that, such a pop hit, even take away from what the message is there? I think we've talked about this kind of thing in the past on the show is, do you lose the mission? Do you lose the cause by turning it into something that reaches a wider mainstream surface level kind of product there?
A great artist once said that even if they do not inspire everyone to perform an act of good, if they can inspire the one person who can perform the most good, then they've done their job.
Yeah.
We're going to move on though and talk about Piano Phase, which was composed in 1967. The piece begins with a recording of Reich playing a 12-note sequence. He then plays back the sequence as he begins to play along while it loops. He then slowly quickens his playing ahead of the recording to create a natural phase, only taking moments to retain speed when the rhythm of the notes match. After a moment, he speeds himself up again to the next rhythmic meeting point until both pianos play in unison once again. An 8-note sequence is then played with a second piano playing a distinct 8-note pattern. That combination is then phased. A 4-note pattern is then played and phased, returning to unison to end the piece. This is one of my favorite things about piano phase, and it really has nothing to do about the piece itself. It's about Reich's rationale for doing piano phase, and it has to do with the fact that even he knew that tape pieces were kind of kitschy. Here's a little excerpt from an interview where he explains this.
Well, you know, this is a machine process. This is something tape recorders do, windshield wipers on a bus do it, bells at a railroad crossing do it, but people can't do that. But it's so fantastic. But people don't do that. And I just thought, well, if people don't do that, then it's just some kind of mechanical gimmick, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life locked up in, you know, in a tape loop machine.
What strikes me about his thinking here is how the music isn't legitimate unless it can be reproduced.
Yeah.
That's a way to think of it. I actually equate this to, with XTC in the Black Sea review, we were talking about sheet music and how it legitimizes works by continuing the legacy of a piece. When the artist is no longer there, the piece lives on because there's sheet music, someone can reproduce it and then work upon it. Granted, Reich kind of contradicts me here because he doesn't really write scores for his pieces. So whatever. But I mean, essentially the intent is still there.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an extremely hard piece to play, especially if you're just one person. I've actually seen one person do it where they use both their hands and one did the slow rhythm, one did the quick one.
Wow.
And actually was able to get it to work. And it was shaky at times, but pretty remarkable. When we compare this to Come Out or to It's Gonna Rain, we're finally here with a musical instrument, but it's still phasing. It's still not locking in rhythmically. We're still going from one combination to the next and those weird transitions. How did you react to this piece in comparison to Come Out and It's Gonna Rain?
What I've been thinking of lately with this piece in particular, and I need someone, whether that's you or someone who knows this stuff much better than I do, I've been thinking about the score to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, actually, which doesn't have much music. It's a lot of ambient music, but a lot of the battle pieces are these very quick piano tapping pieces. And immediately I thought back to the Steve Reich thing that you had me listening to here. I'm like, there's not phasing going on, but just the approach to it and the types of sounds, it really made me think like, there's precedent for something like this.
When we compare that to this, where that's not showing so much harmony, and this is extremely harmonic because all these notes are playing very well with each other. This is within the harmonic series. What you're getting here is, in the combinations, some really interesting, I would say a mosaic, or not really a moire pattern that Eno was talking about with It's Gonna Rain, but more so like when you listen to Baba O'Reilly, or when you listen to some scores of TV shows where there's like the random piano bashing or like random keys being played on a synthesizer. You're not really making sense of it. It's just like harmonic noise.
Think a lot of 80s action movies or horror films.
Yes.
Like first Terminator score or something.
Yes, but in comparison to the other pieces where we're having to make the music ourselves and we're picking out the melody because it's just natural in human speech, even though it may not be intentional.
Yeah, the music is here for sure.
Exactly. So it's a little bit easier to take in. When you listen to the piece, you can tell he's having a hard time merging inward. It's sort of like as soon as you see that rhythmic moment come in, you jump to it because if you miss it, you blew it. You messed the whole point up.
That takes us to the fourth piece here, clapping music in 1972. Clapping music begins with two players repeating a series of arranged claps over 12 beats. The initial grouping of claps is 3, 2, 1, 2, but after 12 repetitions, one of the players moves one beat ahead. The players repeat each movement until both players meet up once again.
Something that we've noticed as we go through these pieces is a simplification of each piece. We start with It's Gonna Rain, where it's very complex, the way he splits up the samples and then phases them in different ways, and he does 2 different samples. Come Out is just one sample, but it's very easily split and moves. Then we've got Piano Phase, where now we're not making the music's there, it's just in different order. And now here we are in clapping music. There's no harmony whatsoever, it's just rhythm, but it's just rhythm going one beat ahead until it meets up again. And so this is phasing, but it is a much simpler version of the phasing that we've been hearing with these 3 other pieces.
Yeah, I can wrap my brain around this. That doesn't mean I can do it well, but I understand it in theory for sure.
When we talk about the average listener coming into pieces like this, and It's Gonna Rain, as you said with your experience, the target was not going to happen.
It's unapproachable if you're looking for music. Like, this is definitely, it is music, but it's something else. You have to put your brain in, I'm sitting to consume a different type of artwork here.
There's something to be said about that process where we have to decide between, are we going to treat this just like noise and just let it play, or are we going to pay attention and look for things or need additional information in order to derive something from this? And that, honestly, I feel is surrealist in nature.
Jeff, we've gone from, all right, I have a mistake on tape that I've turned into artwork, and I'm going to take that and do something new and slightly different with that. All right, this is starting to become a gimmick. I'm going to do this over here with an actual instrument. That all makes sense. The next thing is I'm clapping.
Bit different from everything else, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to take it to Steve Reich, and he's going to give us a quick story about how this came about.
Backstory is we're in Belgium on tour, and the concert's over, and the guy who's who's running who's paying us says, "Would you like to go out and hear some flamenco?" I cocked my head. I said, "Are we in Madrid? Am I crazy?" He says, "No, you're in Brussels." Look, he's paying for it. Let's do it. So we drive off into the foggy Belgian night, and we get to this club and go in, and we have a few drinks, and 2 women come out, and they start to play guitar. Not very good. They start to sing. Not very good. But they start to clap. Wow, what's going on here? So after it was over, we go out into the foggy night, and we're both, we're a little drunk, and we started improvising clapping patterns at each other. And in those days, I didn't trust anybody to give me anything. So I carried all my instruments, all my amplification equipment, all my tube amplifiers, you name it, 2,000 pounds of air freight. And I'm thinking, what if the air freight doesn't arrive? What if the power blows? Hey, clapping! So that's the real genesis of the piece.
This is one of my favorite pieces of Steve Reich's. I can listen to this and enjoy it and actually get more than just inspiration, like with Come Out, where I can hear different rhythmic things every time I listen to it, or new tonal things that I've never thought about.
Yeah, there's nothing new to get out of clapping music every time. It's very mathematically structured for a reason.
But thankfully, with the way that it's recorded, we can hear characteristics of the different players.
Yeah.
So I can tell who is the one jumping ahead versus who isn't. Same kind of idea where you're finding different rhythms here based on how their claps line up. And it's so elemental. I mean, this is incredibly simple. A little bit of the genius of this is that no one else came up with this before. Even though clapping, of course, they're listening to this Spanish-inspired music, but they never thought to do it in this kind of way that's so elemental. It's gotten to the point, Mike, where this 3-2-1-2 structure is something that I'll do on like doors. When I go to knock on a door, I'll do, on the door or something like it's just, it happens to intrinsically come to me when I'm doing something with a very basic rhythm. And I think it just lends itself to the genius of the piece, honestly.
Yeah.
We tried, folks, we seriously tried to do clapping music on our own and to perform it for you. And seriously, as simple as this thing sounds, it was so hard to perform this piece.
It was really hard. Yeah.
So hard. In fact, back in April, I was able to see a performance of some of his work at Princeton University. He happened to be in town and also did a Q&A after the performances. And I got the chance to, first of all, thank him for some of his compositions and also to ask him a simple question, which was, I am going to force my friend to perform clapping music with me. What piece of advice could you give us to best perform the work? And all he said was, rehearse. And boy, was he right.
Yeah.
Because it was so hard to stay on rhythm. And I'm going to play a little bit here of how we did. started matching me. You actually phased into my clapping. That is so awesome. All right, so it wasn't really as smooth as I was hoping it would be, but it was still really fun to try and perform.
It was, definitely.
I actually had you try and practice with something.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what I told you to play with?
Yeah, dare I say there's an app for that. There absolutely is. Clapping music app that's on the iOS store. It's a wonderful little thing. I mean, if you're familiar with any music rhythm-based video game from the last few years, think of something like DDR, Rock Band, Guitar Hero, something with a pattern coming towards you and notes you need to hit. It's exactly what it gives you. Is a progressing series of circles to hit on the right beat. The thing that was difficult for me is I can keep doing that bass rhythm until the cows come home. But as soon as I need to be the one who's phasing things, it immediately falls apart.
This is exactly why I was looking forward to trying it with you, because I can handle that. That part is fun to me. It's the repetition where I just get like frustrated because it's like this is the same thing over and over.
It is, but you know why I don't get frustrated doing it is because like I know that Jeff is going to be phasing it now and I can't get thrown off. I have to be awesome at what I'm doing here. Don't let him throw you off.
And I remember you were putting your hands to your ear.
I was, so I could hear it better. Like I'm looking away from you, my eyes shut, ears close to my own hands here so I can hear myself. I mean, sound travels at however 700 whatever miles per hour. You're close enough to me that doesn't really affect anything. So if I can get just a little bit louder in my own ear from my own hands, is that my advantage there? Like I'm approaching it like it's a competition even though we're cooperating with each other.
True. And just think about all the videos that you might see of people performing the piece. And are they doing that? No, they're doing their hands right in front of them.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just how hard it is to perform this piece. It is deceptively not that simple. But what is really interesting to me is that the app does a really good job of laying out the notes and having you tap along with it. But just in general, I feel that clapping music does a lot of good for getting a person to become more rhythmic. You know how there are certain people that just can't get a rhythm down or just have trouble with it.
Yeah.
And I feel like clapping music is one of those things where it's not just you doing a repeated pattern over and over again. You're doing different things, but you're forced to align yourself with this regular rhythm. And it's not just this boring 4/4 whatever. It's actually something a little bit more engaging than that.
Yeah.
This is something they teach kids to get their rhythm skills better too. Really fascinating stuff. Those are the 4 pieces of Steve Reich, his early works from the late 1960s into the early 1970s. What is there to make of all of this? I have a few points.
All right.
First, we looked at the prospect of systematic and electronic music taking strength in the post-World War II landscape of Europe. We then saw how Reich is trained in this landscape and yet rejects it, instead taking some influence from its procedural, somewhat mechanical structure and returning back to tonality with the minimalists. We listened to how technology brought about new landscapes of rhythm and harmony with phasing, and we observed how his experiments coalesced into more practical, tangible works by reintroducing a human element. Mike, is there anything you want to add about these works? Any last thoughts that you have about them?
Yeah, so you listen to these and here we are approaching 2020 and it feels very quaint, doesn't it? Like, oh, you took a one little thing, couple words, and you just moved the Audacity thing just over a little bit, and then you made another track with the same thing and just brought it right back over again. Like, it's trivial to make something like It's Gonna Rain today. We could do it 5 minutes. We would have another masterpiece like this, but it wouldn't be because the technology affords us that luxury and that convenience of doing something like this. You see where something like this in many ways had to be a mistake to start in, like, oh, I hear a new type of sound by doing this. And as you listen, like you were talking about, so many people come back like, oh yeah, this is where I got that idea to do something like that. That they can do that now so easily in their new artistic creations, I think is a wonderful thing.
The real impact of this music is not so much about what it did for modern music, but rather what other people did with it. Like I said with Come Out, which is, I think, one of the best examples, I was hearing new things every time I was listening to it.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't feel compelled to go back and do repeated listenings, there were still things I was drawing from it that was new every time I'd give it a listen.
Mm-hmm.
So there are other artists that have done the same thing. We're going to go into our further listening section here, and here are some artists that listened to Come Out and did their own things with it. For example, Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band, the song Moonlight on Vermont from 1969.
Well, come out to show them. 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 Come out.
This is from the album Trout Mask Replica, which has been widely regarded by rock critics as an important work of experimental music and art rock. We're going to move on to Orbital. Mike, you've heard of Orbital.
Absolutely.
Right? Influential electronic dance music duo. They composed the song Time Becomes, which uses a Star Trek reference of all things, and this is on their 1992 album.
in the fabric of space where time becomes a loop. 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 Where time becomes a loop.
Here we have an example of phasing being done with an entirely different sample. Next, we're going to go away from phasing specifically and how it's used to how his works were sampled, and the most notable one that I know of is from the group Madvillain, the song America's Most Blunted from the album Madvillainy in 2004.
Come out to show them, 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 come out to show them,
This is the only album from MF Doom and Madlib, but this received many rave reviews and ended up on many year-end best of lists. And this is just an example of one of the many hip-hop artists that have used Reich's influence over time. I've got a little bit more for further listening, but this time it's with clapping music. It's a David Bowie song. This is from the song Love Is Lost. It's a remix done by James Murphy of the DFA, and it's from the album The Next Day Extra from 2013.
It's the darkest hour, you're 22. The voice of youth, the hour of dread. Darkest hour, and your voice is new. Love is lost, lost is love. Your country's...
That was a sample from Love Is Lost, Hello Steve Reich mix by James Murphy for the DFA. We just played a small sample so you can get a taste of it, but I definitely recommend you check out the full thing.
Yeah, just keep listening.
Especially from the beginning. Well, there you go. Some music to check out if you want to see how these pieces have influenced artists you may have heard before. I also want to thank everybody for following us on this journey with the early works of Steve Reich. I do hope that you go and check out some of these pieces on your own. Let us know if you have any different experiences than we did with them. Did you find anything interesting in these works? And where the heck are we going to be taking this in the future? We're going to return to composer Steve Reich once again on an episode in the near future when we review one of his more epic long-form works. But for now, Mike.
Yes, so that was our discussion on the early works of Steve Reich. We're always interested in hearing what you have to say about the topics we discuss. So join the discussion on our subreddit or send us your take, feedback at low-fidelity.info.
Next time on the show, something completely different. Until then, thank you for listening to Low Fidelity, and we'll see you again in a couple weeks.